This is Orlando Sentinel Now.
Hello and welcome. It's Tuesday, October 12th, and this is Orlando Sentinel Now. Today, we're talking about the state's vaccine passport probe into Florida businesses, as well as the state's nursing shortage. I'm your host, Joe Mario Pedersen, and joining me today, I have politics editor Steve Lemongello and health reporter Caroline Catherman. Thank you both so much for being here today. Let's go ahead and jump right in. Steve, I want to come to you first for one of your most recent headlines. We've got Florida vaccine passport probes target Harry Styles concerts, libraries, counterterrorism squads, and many others. Getting into this, can you tell us about the probe itself?
Starting last month, the ban on DeSantis's and essentially the states now, he started with an executive order, then it was passed by law by the Republican legislature, of a ban against any state agency or even a business from requiring proof of vaccination in order to use the services or be allowed entry into the business. If they find some sort of under this law, supposedly, depending on, I'm sure it will go into the courts because this is a very, very controversial law. Essentially telling businesses what it can and cannot do. It's a lot of controversy there. They would be fined up to $5,000 per person, which is a lot of people, a lot of money. We requested, and they had to give us the list of businesses and agencies that are being quote unquote investigated. Now, this doesn't mean that they're going to get in the $5,000 pop fines. Basically, according to the health spokesman we emailed with yesterday, any Floridian or visitor can contact the health department to say that they think that a business or agency is breaking this anti-vaccine passport law. So this doesn't necessarily mean that the things on this list will be getting fined or they're in violation. It's just that someone essentially, narked on them. So, but there's a lot of, eye-opening things in here. We got House of Blues at Disney Springs. We got the Amway Center for the Harry Styles concert. We've got the Kravis Center, Raytheon Technologies, the Broward Center for the Performing Arts down in Fort Lauderdale, Naples Community Hospital, the Alachua County Public Library, the Counterterrorism Squad for the FDLE in Jacksonville. We have the Miami Marlins, but not any other sports team in Florida, despite the fact the Rays were playing up until yesterday. We have the Dr. Phillips Center, which is interesting because the Dr. Phillips Center, according to its website, does not have a vaccination requirement. It requires proof of a negative test and masks, but not vaccinations. So its presence on there, whether it's possibly just someone just filing a complaint anyway, even though they probably won't end up, being fined, who knows? It also leads into, a potential sort of quirk in the new law.
Now, one of those names, one of those violators that the probe mentions, is of course Orange County Mayor Jerry Demings. I'm wondering what has Jerry Demings said in relation to this, and what are other violators saying about these violations?
Yeah, Demings yesterday said the county would vigorously defend itself after it received a letter from the health department threatening fines for mandating vaccines for its workforce. His quote was, "I won't assume until we receive something more definitive that we're in violation or purport to be in violation, so we'll just have to wait and see." At this point, the courts have not reached a final decision, but the indication is the Florida law flies in the face of our Florida Constitution and perhaps in the face of common sense. So yeah, so even these the names on this list doesn't even mean that even if the law is found to be valid and people do end up facing $5,000 fines and businesses and agencies, that doesn't mean that anything on this list necessarily will do that. Like I said, it's quite possible these are just someone somewhere filed a complaint. And like Deming said, this law is very, very controversial. It's making its way through the courts. Who knows how far this thing is going to go? It's very unclear, if anyone in the end is actually going to have to pay any of these fines.
Certainly something that we'll be looking out for, though. If you're all interested in seeing that complete list or more information on the story, take a look at the report at orlandosentinel.com. Steve, thanks a lot. All right, Caroline, I want to come over to you now for a story about the nursing shortage in Florida and how that could be a lot worse come down the road. That most recent headline, Florida nursing schools need more funding faculty to prevent a 60,000 nursing shortfall by 2035. Now, this information is coming to us from a report giving this forecast. What have we learned from this report?
The report was commissioned by the Florida Hospital Association, and essentially what the report is saying is, given that Florida has an aging population, given that Florida is expected to have some population growth, given population trends and number of nurses retiring and the number coming into the state. We could face a shortage of up to nearly 60,000 nurses by 2035. Now, what's really interesting about this report is it actually completely does a 180 from a report released in 2017 by the US government, which essentially actually found that Florida would have a surplus of nurses by 2030. So this report essentially says that it used updated methodology, it used updated data, and the government organization that did the first report, I reached out to them. They said they'll have their own projections later this year. But what's really interesting about this report is the report emphasizes that one important solution to this could be improving Florida's pipeline of nurses who are graduating from schools. I think in 2019, the Florida Nursing Association did this study, and there were thousands of people who wanted to be nurses in Florida, and there were far fewer spots than people who wanted to be nurses. So schools had to reject qualified applicants, and it's a problem that continues to this day. In addition, a lot of Florida's nursing schools are of poor quality. There's an exam called the NCLEX that someone has to pass in order to become licensed for a nurse. Florida consistently has the lowest rates of passing of any U.S. state. Florida nurses also make a lower salary than average compared to other states. So there's a lot of areas that we could work on improving.
A lot there that I want to unpack, Caroline. But first of all, I wanted to touch on what you mentioned as far as having these schools being forced to turn away a number of very qualified applicants because they simply just don't have the room for them. However, there were some schools that were noted as not meeting their, I guess, limited capacity numbers. They were actually turning away students before they hit capacity. Why is that?
Yeah, so the report didn't exactly look at that, but it put forth some theories, as did another report that sort of found the same thing from the Florida Nursing Association in 2019. And essentially, there could be multiple reasons. Students could be applying more to some schools that have those higher NCLEX pass rates and are generally more well regarded. There are a lot of for-profit institutions in Florida that have really low NCLEX pass rates. There's some online programs that have low rates. It's also just possible that the schools couldn't find enough faculty to maximize their program capacity. It is apparently, I've been told, hard to find nurses who want to leave the field to become faculty, especially because those nurses have to have advanced degrees, master's degrees, and many nurses don't. You don't need that to practice as a nurse. A final limiting factor could be lack of clinical sites, which is where nurses need to go to get their on-the-job experience. And there might just not be enough spots open in hospitals for the number of people who want to be nurses.
Last thing I wanted to touch on here before moving on, Caroline, is you mentioned a number of solutions that the report puts out. I'm wondering, what have critics said about those solutions? Are they realistic goals that we can hit?
Yes. So one critic is the largest union of nurses in the United States, National Nurses United. And essentially, I talked to a representative from there, and her perspective is that it's important to remember that this report was commissioned by the Florida Hospital Association, right? And this report does focus more on what schools could be doing to increase the number of nurses than it does on how hospitals could be improving working conditions for nurses to attract more. One of this report's suggestions was to do more studies to figure out why nurses are leaving the field, why nurses are retiring early, and why more nurses aren't coming to Florida, why some nurses are leaving Florida. The National Nurses United representative essentially said, hey, we know why nurses aren't staying in Florida. The salary is lower than the national average. There aren't as many workplace protections as there are in other states. So that was really interesting. Essentially, her point is, hey, you can increase the number of people that are graduating as nurses, but that's not really going to fix the problem in nursing, because they're going to be graduating into a flawed profession that needs so many other things fixed.
Certainly a story that's far from over. But if you're trying to get caught up on it, take a look at Caroline's story at orlandosentinel.com, where, of course, you can get caught up on all different kinds of news that are happening in and around Central Florida. If you're a subscriber to the Orlando Sentinel, thank you so much for continuing to support our work and supporting local journalism. If you want to become a supporter, it's really easy to do so. All you need to do is visit orlandosentinel.com/subscribe. But as for OSN, that will do it for us today. A big thank you to Steve and Caroline for keeping us filled in what's going on in our community. We'll be back again with more news tomorrow at noon. We'll see you then. Stay healthy and stay safe.
Watch Orlando Sentinel Now live every weekday at noon on our Facebook page and on orlandosentinel.com.